Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Since the theme of this conference acknowledges the 200th anniversary of the abolition of the slave trade in 1808, I decided to try to talk about the meaning of freedom. The conference theme emphasizes 200 years of freedom. Now, what has that freedom meant for people of African descent? What has that freedom meant for the black world? And what has been the relationship to communities that are differently racialized, but nonetheless suffer under these cycles of oppression? I suppose that very few people think about the fact that the institution of the prison has claimed a place at the very core, at the very heart of black history, particularly since the abolition of slavery. It has been a constant theme in the collective lives of black people in this country. It has also been a constant theme in the collective lives of Chicanos, and it is increasingly a major aspect of the lives of people who are racially oppressed in Europe, but also in Latin America. And if one looks at the extent to which the institution of the prison is beginning to replace on the continent of Africa institutions like educational institutions, healthcare institutions, and of course, well, you know, February is always a heavy month because we're supposed to be celebrating black history. And the month of February is supposed to be a month that makes those of us who are of African descent feel intensely and collectively proud. We're supposed to feel proud that the accomplishments of our people refute the persisting preconceptions of racial inferiority. And therefore, during this month, we celebrate social justice leaders, we celebrate scholars, we celebrate inventors, we celebrate doctors, we celebrate astronauts, and everything else. Now, when Carter G. Woodson proposed in 1926 that a week be set aside for the celebration of Negro History Week, he was confronting a dominant culture that almost totally marginalized black accomplishments. And it was important to transmit the message that we were capable of vastly more than white supremacist society attributed to black communities. I don't know what the generational composition of the space is this evening, but I assume that most of the students were born in the 1980s, am I right? Yeah? Oh, and the 70s? 90s? Okay, so we have generations spanning those that generation that was born in it has to be early 90s, so right. And maybe we have some geniuses on campus. 90s, 80s, 70s, 60s, 50s, 40s. I have to raise my hand for that one. 30s? Okay, 30s over there. 1915. Oh my, 1915, here. You see, when we come together, we don't take advantage of all of the experiences, you know, all of the history, all of the historical memory that can be generated in this community, temporary though it may be. So some of you do remember Negro History Week, right? You remember it, yeah. And you perhaps remember that Carter G. Woodson chose a particular week in February. He chose the week of Frederick Douglass's birthday, which is on Nobody knows when Frederick Douglass's birthday, February 14th. And you all celebrate Valentine's Day, don't you? Okay. Well, now you have a reason to celebrate February 14th. And then, of course, Abraham Lincoln was born on the 12th. And both figures stood in, at least as far as Carter G. Woodson was concerned, for emancipation, for triumph over slavery. This tradition of celebrating individuals who helped to further realize the triumph over slavery defined for many decades the importance of Negro History Week. And then, of course, a half century later, the celebration was extended to the entire month. And the month of February offers us a kind of microcosm of the history of the black world. February is the month, as far as the United States of America is concerned, when the 15th Amendment, which authorized black suffrage, black male suffrage, and I guess I should say parenthetically that it's very interesting, isn't it, how those debates that happened in the 19th century are being replayed under contemporary conditions. Maybe we'll have a chance to talk about that before we leave today. But I was talking about the month of February. The Freedmen's Aid Society was founded in February. W.E.B. Du Bois was born in February, February 23rd, 1868. And if I remember correctly, I think that was the day I got out on bail. I got out of jail. But it was also during the month of February that W.E.B. Du Bois convened the first Pan-African Congress in 1919 to urge people of African descent throughout the world to unite, not simply because they were of African descent, but to unite in order to stand up against European imperialism. February was also the month when SCLC, Martin Luther King's organization, was established, when the students staged sit-ins at the lunch counters in Greensboro, North Carolina. That was in February of 1960. We could actually do, continue to do a whole panorama of black history by looking at what happened in the month of February. But what I'd like to say now is that Black History Month seems to have become an occasion to generate profit. Look at the Walmart website, Walmart, which is the largest corporation in the world, and look at how they urge you to celebrate Black history by buying their products. Well, I could spend the rest of the afternoon talking about Walmart, because I think, Walmart, as the largest corporation in the world, indicates the impact that global capitalism has had on our lives. And the conditions of neoliberalism under which we live and think mean that capitalism has insinuated itself into our very desires and our dreams and our ways of thinking about ourselves. We commodify ourselves when we talk about how are we going to market ourselves, right? So keep that in mind as we go back and look at some aspects of Black history. And we most frequently celebrate Black History Month in a couple of ways: by evoking a collection of narratives about individual Black people, who managed to overcome the barriers created by the racism of the past, whereas we should have a broader conception of what it means to celebrate the legacies of Black history, and those legacies should not be confined simply to people of African descent. I mean, I'm thinking of someone like Yuri Kochiyama, who is a Japanese-American woman who has, for the overwhelming majority of her life, and she's about 82 years old now, she's worked in the civil rights movement, she's worked to free political prisoners, she was with Malcolm X when he was assassinated, and there's a picture of her cradling Malcolm X's head in her hands as he lay dying. And we don't necessarily bring Yuri Kochiyama into our celebrations of Black History Month. Or Elizabeth Batista Martinez, who was one of the most amazing activists in the early civil rights movement. Now, we celebrate individuals, but we also evoke the legislative and court victories that have helped to produce a Black subject that putatively enjoys equality before the law. And therefore, we rightly celebrate the abolition of the slave trade in 1808. And we also celebrate the 13th Amendment that we think abolished slavery. And we celebrate the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which one of the candidates insisted was the work of, could only be the work of a president. The Voting Rights Act of 1965. Now, many of these legislative moments were attempts to confront the vestiges of slavery, to eradicate the vestiges of slavery. And I think that all of us, regardless of our racial or ethnic background, feel relieved that we no longer have to deal with the racism and the sexism associated with the system of slavery. But we treat slavery like we treat the genocidal colonization of indigenous people in North America as if it never really happened. You know, we think of it as a kind of nightmare. And as is often the case with nightmares, we try not to think about it, except in abstract terms, and we assume that it will go away. I mean, one of the amazing contributions of a group of Black women writers beginning, say, in the 1980s was to think about slavery and to imagine the subjectivities of persons who were enslaved and not allow us to continue to think in these abstract categories. The institution of the prison tells us that the nightmare of slavery continues to haunt us, continues to haunt us. And if we actually learn how to recognize the forms of racism and sexism that are at the structural core of the prison system, that means we'll have to develop a very different idea about the state of democracy in the United States of America, particularly with respect to its victories over racism and sexism. And we hear the Bush administration talking about a nightmare, constantly evoking the civil rights movement as the completion of democracy in the United States, American democracy. The theme of this conference is how to end cycles of oppression. And I want to try to talk about that by making the connection between slavery and the contemporary prison system. First, I want to say that the emancipation that awaited enslaved people in 1863 first, people whose history under slavery had been primarily a history of striving for freedom. This was a constrained emancipation. The joyful noise of freedom to which W.E.B. Du Bois refers in Black Reconstruction had to fend off the forms of unfreedom that were tenaciously clinging to the emancipation offered to the slaves. What did it mean to be a former slave who was free? What did that freedom mean? Well, Du Bois talks about the spectacular dimensions of this newfound freedom, and there were spectacular dimensions because Black people, for the first time, had the freedom to learn, the freedom to try to get an education, the freedom to create schools with what meager resources were there. They had the freedom to travel for the first time. But of course, this was a gendered freedom because it was mostly Black men who were able to take advantage of the freedom to travel. And they also had sexual freedom. And they had the freedom to choose their own sexual partners, which we might minimize today. But considering that there were so many other dimensions of freedom that were not available to the slaves who had been set free, quote unquote, that sexual freedom became so important that it becomes the major theme of the music, the first popular music that gets produced in the aftermath of slavery, the blues. I mean, that is why in virtually every blues song there is something about a relationship. And we saw the wonderful dance by the Cleo Parker Robinson dance company, and we saw, the Nina Simone series, and that's what that was about as well. And I have to say, I'm so glad to see Cleo Parker Robinson. It's been a while, and I'm glad my plane was late, because it meant that I got a real treat. I got to see her company. I haven't seen those dances. I've seen other generations of dancers, but this was it was really wonderful. Cleo, thank you. Yeah, we were talking about sexual freedom as becoming a metaphor for other kinds of freedom, for political freedom, for economic freedom. But these forms of freedom were shrouded in unfreedom. The slavery that was abolished by proclamation, well, the Emancipation Proclamation was about abolishing slavery. At least that's what we think. And then later by amendment to the Constitution, that slavery did not surrender so easily to words. And it strikes me to be very strange that over the decades, we have assumed that it was possible to abolish slavery simply by a proclamation, a few words here, and by a clause in the Constitution. When that proclamation and that constitutional amendment never tell us how they understand slavery. So we don't even know what was supposed to be abolished. Was it chattel slavery? Was it treating human beings as property? Well, human beings are still bought and stole and still treated as property, including people like Shaquille O'Neal, who just got traded, right? Was it about coerced labor? Well, we know there is so much coerced labor. And we look at ways in which undocumented immigrants are treated, and we see a very similar mode of labor. So I don't think the Constitution really abolished coercive labor. You know, what about the whole scaffolding of racist ideology that was necessary to keep an entire people enslaved? Did that get abolished? So why do we assume that slavery was abolished? Slavery was a part of the warp and woof of American life, especially in the South, but also in the North, and words alone were not sufficient to make it go away. But if slavery was declared dead, it was simultaneously reincarnated in new institutions, new practices, new ideologies. And we can think about the ways in which the institutions of punishment served as receptacles for these structures and ideologies of slavery that were translated into the terms of freedom. Slavery translated into the terms of freedom. So that question, you know, what have these 200 years of freedom, or since the 13th Amendment, you know, what has that freedom meant? Both the prison and the fate of former slaves would be inextricably linked to the struggle for democracy in this country. So when we talk about the relationship between slavery and the prison, we're also talking about the nature of democracy, or what goes under the rubric of democracy in this country. Now, prison populations continue to reflect the closure of the doors of democracy to major populations. We can say that one of the major aspects of slavery was social death. That also included civil death. That meant that slaves could not participate in the political arena or in civil life. And so, what about felon disenfranchisement today? You know, what about the fact that there are 2.2 million people behind bars? But that's only on a given day. You know, statistics can be deceptive, because many of us know that figure, 2.2 million, but that only reflects a census that gets taken on a given day. It's the average number of people who are in prison on any given day. Now, if you look at the number of people who go in and out of the prison and jail system over the course of a year, that's going to be 13 million people. So that's much more vast than we have the habit of thinking about. Now, the vast majority of these 2.2 million people, or these 13 million people, come from communities of color. And this has to do with the restrictive and repressive nature of what is called U.S. democracy. There's a majority of black people in prison throughout the country, but if you look at, I come from California, if you look at the state of California, the majority of people in California are Latinos, Chicanos and Latinos, and other Latinos. Now, the structural racism of the prison. You see, what's very interesting is that people don't get convicted because they are black anymore, or because they are Chicano. But there are structures of racism that makes race matter in terms of determining who goes to prison, particularly who gets to go to prison and who gets to go to colleges and universities. And how can we think about that structural racism? What is the relationship between the structural racism of slavery and the racism that is inscribed in the very processes that create trajectories that lead inevitably toward incarceration? Now, The structural racism of the prison can also be held responsible for the persistence of racism in the so-called free world. We are encouraged to think about racial equality as produced by adopting postures of colorblindness, right? And we were told that all we have to do is not notice race, and racism is going to leave. It will go away. And so there is a kind of learned ignorance, because we can see race, but we know we are not supposed to see race. There is a kind of repression that oftentimes produces these many explosive expressions of racism. And people, I can remember the Michael Richards comment after, he said what he did. And his response was, "I'm not a racist. I don't even know where that came from." And this is what people say increasingly. They can't understand how it is that that a racist observation escapes from their lips. There's a whole psychic reservoir of racism in this country. It's in the structures, it's in our collective psyche, and all of us are affected by it. I'm not only talking about white people as the bearers of racism, I'm talking about ideologies and logics that inform the way all of us relate to the world. Now, prisons, of course, thrive on class inequalities. They thrive on racial inequalities. They thrive on gender inequalities. They produce and reproduce those inequalities because these institutions segregate and isolate the individuals they punish. They also conceal the inequalities that they reproduce. And the hidden danger of relying on incarceration as the major solution to behaviors that are often the byproducts of poverty is that the solution reproduces the very problem it purports to solve. And this is why we might, this is how we might begin to understand why the prison population constantly rises, not only in absolute numbers, but proportionately as well. And it has nothing to do with the rise in crime statistics. As the rate of crime goes down, prison populations go up. And of course, they reproduce these problems because funds almost inevitably migrate away from education and housing and healthcare towards what they call corrections. Therefore, one generation spawns another. The crime rate has fallen, but the incarceration rate has risen. In the US, of course, a prison sentence on a felony charge is a life sentence, regardless of how many years one gets. It is a life sentence because of what someone like Mark Maurer calls collateral consequences, the collateral consequences of imprisonment that leads to social death, disenfranchisement. We wouldn't be dealing with the Bush administration, or wouldn't have had to deal with the Bush administration over the last 7 years, had not it been for the case that due to felony disenfranchisement, over 600,000 people could not vote in Florida. And there was only, in the 2000 elections, there was only a 537 votes. 600,000 people had been able to vote. We might have had an entirely different course of history. Now, if the prison is proposed as the solution, then other possibilities get excluded. So, you know, some people say, like, my governor, he's not my governor, but the governor, Schwarzenegger, the governor of the state in which I live, changed the name of the California Department of Corrections to the California Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections. So if we really want rehabilitation, then we have to start talking about decarceration. How is rehabilitation possible under conditions of total confinement? How is rehabilitation possible when there is no way that people can exercise their freedoms? As a matter of fact, that's the whole point of the punishment of imprisonment. It deprives you of your rights and liberties. That is why the prison is a peculiarly democratic punishment. It is the quintessential democratic institution because it provides you with the negation of that upon which the whole concept of, I would say, bourgeois democracy has been developed. Now, prison, the assumption that if you are from a certain racialized community, you will have had some contact with the prison system. I mean, it's another way of saying is the relationship between racialization and criminalization. There was an interesting study that was conducted by a sociologist who matched black and white pairs of job applicants, and some of them indicated that they had a conviction, criminal conviction, and some of them didn't. What was very interesting was that white people who had a felony conviction were called back for interviews at the same rate as black people who had the same credentials but had no criminal record. So, and this is the point that Mark Maurer makes. He says, black men are essentially born with the stigma of a felony conviction. So we're talking about an institution that not only affects those it incarcerates, it has an influence on entire communities. And talking about gender, women constitute and have constituted for a while the fastest growing sector of the imprisoned population. And women of color, of course, constitute the largest group of women, therefore the fastest growing population within the entire imprisoned population. And this is not just the case in the US. It's true in Canada, it's increasingly true in Europe, it's true in other countries as well. If we look at who is in prison and why they're there, if we look beyond the crime statistics, then it's clear that race and class have much more to do with the overcrowding of these prison institutions than the existence of crime. And once people have spent time in prison, they are forever haunted by the status, their status as prisoner. They're forever haunted by civil death. They're forever excluded from certain aspects of democratic participation in the society. So this is a way of understanding why black and Latino people are so easily labeled criminal, so easily identified as threats to law and order. And it helps us understand why people from those communities often see their own sisters and brothers as the criminals, as the menaces, as the threats. The immigrant, for example, is scapegoated. The undocumented immigrant is seen as the enemy. And there's a racialization of immigration. Because the immigration, post-colonial, post-Soviet, post-socialist immigration to this country has come from all over the world, and especially from places like Russia. huge numbers of Russian immigrants. But do we ever think about undocumented immigrants as Russian? Do we ever racialize them as white? So you begin to understand how the ideology of racism really infects the very logic of our thought. And this is why Michael Richards can say, I don't know where that came from. I'm not a racist, I'm colorblind, right? Beneath that repression is this huge, dangerous reservoir of racist notions about our relations to one another. Now, I wanted to talk for a moment about how this criminalization process, particularly with respect to black people, is anchored in slavery. And I wanted to make a connection between the democracy we think we now enjoy and the democracy that was offered to people of African descent in the aftermath of slavery. Even during slavery, there was a contradiction in the way black people were thought about. We tend to think, well, slavery meant that black people were treated as property, right? That's chattel slavery. But then black people were punished. They were found guilty. And can property be accountable? Can property be found culpable? There was something wrong there. And as a matter of fact, you can say that even though black people were not acknowledged as having legal personality, in most senses, when they committed a crime, they were accountable to the law, and therefore they were acknowledged as having legal personality. Now, this negative affirmation of the legal personality of black people continues to hold sway today. And you might say that the proof of participation of black people in U.S. democracy is precisely the fact that they have received due process before being sentenced in such disproportionate numbers to prison. It is precisely as they appear before the law as equal subjects who get due process, precisely because they are considered accountable, or it's through their culpability, does that make sense? Through their culpability that they participate in the democratic process. And that reflects actually the contradiction of slavery. And that, I think, is an indication of one of the ways in which slavery continues to haunt us. Now, before I complete my presentation and we move into the question and answer period, I have to say something about corporate globalization. I started by gesturing towards Walmart. And I have to say that corporate globalization has become the major threat to democracy in the world. But the problem is that capitalism represents itself as synonymous with democracy. That is what George Bush is talking about when he calls for the defense of democracy against terror. That is the democracy that the U.S. military is fighting to protect in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. It's not democracy, it's capitalism, or it's a democracy that uses capitalism as its model, that sees the free market as the paradigm for freedom, and that sees competition as the paradigm for freedom. Now, corporations are linked to the global marketing of imprisonment. They discover enormous profits in this area. Prisons at the expense of housing and healthcare and education and other social services. As a matter of fact, the the neoliberal conception of economic freedom requires the government to withdraw from virtually all social services. The market is supposed to determine everything. Freedom emerges because the market will determine the distribution of education, the distribution of healthcare, and according to the Chicago boys, Milton Friedman and those people, it will even itself out, and it will, I guess they still believe in Adam Smith's invisible hand, right? That somehow or another, freedom will reveal itself. But when we look at the extent to which countries in the southern region have been devastated by these new policies and devastated by the juggernaut of privatization. A country like South Africa, which is still, I suppose, our hope for a non-racist and non-sexist and non-homophobic society, they're experiencing enormous problems precisely as a result of privatization that is required by the IMF and other international financial organizations as that which countries must do who wish to get international loans. It's really scary. And we see that kind of structural adjustment having happened in this country. That is why we're confronted with this crisis of healthcare, and why healthcare has become totally privatized. Since the 1980s, totally privatized. And there was an attempt to totally privatize the prison system as well. It worked in some places, it didn't quite work in others, but we see the insinuation of private corporations into the prison system all over this country. And I wonder why we do not find it utterly shameful that it is possible now to visit countries in the global south and discover that while their educational systems and housing subsidies and jobs have deteriorated over the last quarter century under the impact of globalization, it is often possible to discover a shiny new prison that would lead one to believe that one had been teleported back to Colorado or California. And of course, we use the term prison industrial complex to point out that there is this global proliferation of prisons and prisoners that is more clearly linked to economic and political structures and ideologies than to individual criminal conduct and efforts to curb crime. Now, I wanted to say a few words about this prison industrial complex that has this increasingly privileged place within the global economy, and the way in which it serves to support the persistence of racism, but also how it has become a gendering apparatus. And I don't think we think about the fact that there are prisons for men and there are prisons for women, right? Now, what about people who are gender non-conforming? Because I think we've learned over the last period that there are more than two genders. So what happens to them? Where do they go? Or where does a transgender woman get sent, or a transgender man get sent, or someone who doesn't necessarily identify as male or female? Of course, the prisons do, they rely on the old notions of biology, that biology has the answers for everything. And so they inspect people's genitals. And it's based on the genitalia that they get classified as a certain gender and therefore sent to certain prisons. And then, of course, there are problems with violence. And people often argue, well, if you send a transgender woman to a men's prisons because she has male genitalia, she's going to be subject to rape. Because we think, that rape is something that somehow male prisoners begin to do once they go to prison. We don't ask ourselves why. You know, where does that come from? We don't ask ourselves about the extent to which the institution itself promotes that violence, needs that violence, generates that sexual violence in order for the system to work. And then we see it happen in Abu Ghraib, and we see it happen in Guantanamo, and we express such shock that this is not the way America is supposed to operate. But if we look at what happens on a daily routine in the domestic prisons in this country, we see that violence, we see that sexual coercion. And of course, women have been especially hurt by these developments. The prison industrial complex has brought in women from the global south, indigenous women in numbers that are so disproportionate into this global prison industrial complex. The prison industrial complex has become so big and powerful that it works to perpetuate itself. It's self-perpetuating. The raw materials are immigrant youth and youth of color throughout the world. So if one visits a prison in Australia or France, the Netherlands, Italy, Sweden, one sees young people who come from communities that we in the US designate as communities of color. You see indigenous people. And so race matters a great deal throughout the world now. This is something that the US has basically offered to the world, a way of managing their social problems by refusing to confront them, by putting people who have these problems behind bars. And we can't deny that there are people in prison who've done horrible, hurtful things to others. But these aren't the majority of prisoners. And there are many people in the free world who've done horrible, hurtful things. And there are many reasons why people engage in violence, sometimes out of malice, sometimes out of mental illness, sometimes out of self-defense. Many women who are in prison for having committed violent acts have killed in desperation in order to extricate themselves from a violent, intimate relationship. But whatever people have been convicted of, does it make sense to house hundreds, sometimes thousands of people together or separately in isolation cells, deprive them of contact with their families, deprive them of education, deprive them of health care, deprive them of home, and then assume that this is going to be rehabilitation? Now, I'd like to end with these questions. How do we imagine and struggle for a democracy that does not spawn these forms of terror, that does not spawn war, that does not need enemies for its sustenance? Because people who are in prison are pointed to as the enemies of society, and that is one of the ways in which we can define our own sense of ourselves as free by looking at those who are our opposites, the evil, to use a word that George Bush really likes to use. So how do we imagine a democracy that does not thrive on this racism, that does not thrive on homophobia, that is not based on the rights of capitalist corporations to plunder the world's economic and social and physical environments? I suggest we use our imaginations to try to come up with versions of democracy in which, for example, the practice of Islam does not serve as a pretext for incarceration in an immigration detention facility or in a military prison, where torture and sexual coercion are not considered appropriate treatment. Versions of democracy that allow for the kinds of substantive rights, the right to decent, fulfilling employment, a living wage, the right to quality education. I sound like a candidate now, don't I? Yeah. The right to live in a world where education is not a commodity, but I don't think they say that, but rather a creative discipline that allows us to understand all the worlds we inhabit, both human and non-human. The kind of education that compels us to transcend the limits of nationalist patriotism in order to imagine ourselves as citizens of the globe. Thank you very much.